This last section will look at metabolism of both lipids and so to start out, lipids and proteins are also used for energy due to the same pathways that we metabolize pyruvic acid. So when we have more food energy that's taken into our body that's needed, we can't store the ATP for later. So instead we have to convert glucose into glycogen and fat, and then ATP production is then later inhibited. So let's look into the pathway now. So when we have the conversion of glucose into glycogen, this occurs typically within the liver, but can also occur within skeletal muscles and then within the cardiac muscle. And so we have glucose is going to be phosphorylated, and then it's going to be isomerized into glycogen. So here we have glucose, and then it changes its conformation, and then it stores as glycogen. Thus, when we need to use glucose as our primary energy source, then what can happen is that there's an enzyme called glycogen synthase that will be able to reconvert that glycogen back into glucose, and so it can undergo in the acetyl-CoA and citric acid cycle, or will generate the bulk of our ATP. Now the purpose too of the conversion is so that we don't have glucose that's continuously re-entering the bloodstream, because if that was the case, then everybody would be considered diabetic. Lipids undergo a similar fashion where they are broken down into their glycerol and fatty acid substances, and so they can enter into the bloodstream and then undergo and turn into pyruvic acid and then acetyl-CoA and then go through the citric acid cycle to generate ATP. With lipid metabolism, glucose doesn't complete glycolysis to form pyruvic acid, and the acetyl-CoA already formed is joined together to produce a variety of lipids. And so this includes cholesterol, ketone bodies, as well as several fatty acids. And so as we have ATP levels increasing after an energy-rich meal, then we have the production of ATP that stops. And so this helps to prevent excessive buildup of energy within our tissues. So what we'll have then is the fatty acids are going to join with glycerol and then form triglycerides in our adipose tissue and then within the liver. And so this is where we have lipogenesis, the generation of lipids that occurs. And so over time, if we have excessive amounts of lipogenesis, that means that we have excessive fat buildup within our different organs. We have two different types of adipose, and so white adipose or white fat, and then we also have brown fat or brown adipose. So when we look at white adipose tissue, white fat, this is fat that's stored within our adipose as triglycerides, and it stores the most energy, where 1 gram of fat is equal to 9 kilocalories of energy. So typically in non-obese, 155 man, 80 to 85% of stored energy is in the form of fat. So that's about 140,000 calories. So with white fat, we have lipolysis, and so lysis means the breaking down. And so with lipid or lipolysis, we have the breaking down of triglycerides into fatty acids and glycerol, and the enzyme that's used for that is the lipase enzyme. And so from there, then we can release that energy and use that for our demands for the body. So we'll have fatty acids that then will enter the blood as blood-borne energy carriers and then distribute it throughout the entire body. And then glycerol will be taken up to the liver and then converted to glucose through glucogenesis. That way we can store any extra energy and have it on demand when we need it for later, for such activities like with exercising or being strenuous. Reaction that occurs for fatty acids to be used as energy sources is called beta oxidation. And so this is where enzymes remove acetic acid molecules from fatty acids and then they make the acetyl-CoA. So for every 2 carbons on a fatty acid, 1 acetyl-CoA will be formed. And so thus, if we have a 16 carbon fatty acid, we'll generate 8 acetyl-CoA. So then each acetyl-CoA will go through then the citric acid cycle. And so the big payoff then is that we generate 108 ATP. So you can see that this is way more effective in ATP production for us when we compare it just to using glucose. So it is important that we do have some fat so that we can have energy on demand for our body needs. Brown adipose tissue or brown fat is not as common as we age and as we become adults. We do have some areas that we still have it, like underneath the scapula is one area. But the purpose of this is mostly for thermogenesis or heat production. And so this is very high with newborns. And so again, we do have some of this, and it helps as well as with heat production, but also contributes to calorie use as well. With brown fat, however, we do have less ATP that's formed as compared to with white fat, and that is because of only using the fatty acids to generate more heat rather than using it for strictly energy. When we have circumstances where lipid breakdown is that greater than that of fatty acid utilization, such as like when we're in starvation situations, dieting, or with uncontrollable diabetes, then we have an excessive buildup of fatty acids in the blood. And the liver, though, will convert the fatty acids into acetyl-CoA, and then what it will do is form ketone bodies that will then be distributed throughout the bloodstream. High levels of ketones will decrease the pH within the blood, and so this can be very severe because this condition is called ketosis, where it can lead to coma and death. And so again, what we have here, though, is production of some glucose from a non-carbohydrate source, but the issue is when it becomes higher in terms of breakdown than what the body actually can use. So now let's look into amino acid metabolism, and we have our main source of nitrogen for the body comes from the proteins that we eat. And amino acids are going to be consumed by our dietary proteins that will replace the proteins within the body. And so this helps to drive then anabolic reactions for us. However, if we have more amino acids that are consumed than we need, then the excessive amount of amino acids will be converted into carbohydrates or fat, primarily within our different muscle tissue. And so our bodies can make 12 of the 20 amino acids from other molecules, and so these are termed to be non-essential amino acids. Now, the essential amino acids are the ones that our body does not generate, and so we term those as essential, and so you can see in this table here on the right that these are the essential amino acids that we need to obtain from diet, and then the non-essential amino acids that we are able to produce. The reaction for using energy from proteins is termed oxidative deamination. And so when we have more amino acids than are needed for the body, the mean group from glutamic acid is stripped into an intermediate and then will be excreted as urea in the urine, which urea is a waste product that is generated. And so oxidative deamination forms pyruvic acid or other citric acid cycle intermediates, which later will be converted either to energy or to glucose or fat. And so the formation of glucose from amino acids, it's called neogenesis and occurs within the Cori cycle, within skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. And the main substrates are going to be 3 carbon rings of alanine, lactic acid, and glycerol. Okay, so when we look at this figure, what we have is the amino acids are either going to be converted into keto acids, which will again be forms of intermediates that can later enter the citric acid cycle, or they'll be formed into glutamic acid, and then when we have an excess, then we'll have an increase in in ammonia, and then what happens is that we'll have that conversion into urea, and then so that we can excrete that from the body as waste material. And here, when we put it all together for our different energy sources, so with glucose and with ketone bodies, most of this is going to come from the liver. And so this will be converted from glycogen that later can enter into the citric acid cycle, where it will be converted into pyruvic acid and then later acetyl-CoA, and then we'll continue on. If oxygen is present, we'll undergo then oxidative phosphorylation. Fatty acids then are coming from adipose tissue, primarily from white adipose tissue, but a little bit also from brown, where again we'll have the conversion into glycerol and fatty acids, and then will too be converted later on into pyruvic acid and then into acetyl-CoA. So lactic acid and amino acids are going to be generated within the muscles, and so waste products, when we have excess, are going to be excreted as urea for those nitrogenous bases, but those can also then be converted into pyruvic acid, or or can directly enter into the citric acid cycle depending on the amino acid that's present. And so when we look at this table here, we look at the distribution of energy requirements for different organs and why we need to have these different mechanisms for breaking down and using this energy. So big organ for the brain, we get most of our energy from glucose, so that we use that rapidly and right away. And then a little bit though from ketone bodies, which again is not a problem only when we have an excess of them. With skeletal muscle, most of our energy demands will come from fatty acids, but then a little bit from ketone bodies. And then with glucose, for the liver, those demands are mostly coming from fatty acids, more so with ketone bodies, and then some from both lactic acid and for glucose. And again, the big thing with the liver is because it has to create those different forms or isomers that can store our different forms of molecules that can be generated later. And then the heart, we have most of it coming from fatty acid with a little bit from glucose, ketone bodies, and with lactic acid.